Good afternoon, everyone. It's 4 o'clock. I want to welcome you all to this session of meeting by the Bennington Planning Commission for the purposes of continuing the conversation about referrals to the Select Board in regards to the Chelsea Solar proposal. I want to thank Mike Cutler and Cat TV for being here. They're not doing live, but they will be doing a tape broadcast.
I have to recluse myself, Mr. Chairman. I live in a neighborhood.
Yes, Ken.
Thank you, Ken.
I like the Mr. too. We have some pathways today that we would very much like to follow relative to the progression of the meeting. I will ask Dan if he could outline today's meeting procedure.
Okay. If anybody can't hear me or anybody that's speaking, please raise your hand and we'll ask folks to elevate the volume a little bit. I know this room is less than ideal for acoustics, so feel free to raise your hand or wave, whatever you need to do to get our attention so we can get folks to project a little bit more, and I'll try to remember that myself, especially with masks. Makes it sometimes difficult. Couple of notes about tonight's meeting. So tonight's meeting will be an evidence gathering meeting only. This Planning Commission will not deliberate. They will not make any decisions this evening. We will set another meeting at the end of this meeting where the Planning Commission will publicly deliberate, but there will be no more evidence gathering at that meeting. It will be a meeting for the Planning Commission to discuss in open session what decision they'd like to make regarding recommendations to the Select Board on this particular project. So tonight is all about getting the information to the folks that need to make the recommendation. Next meeting, they'll deliberate regarding that information and formulate their recommendations excuse me, to the Select Board. So just want to make clear, if you have information to submit, please submit this evening. We will also accept written submissions of information after this meeting. So if you want to submit information in a written format, email, old-fashioned paper, please do so. And we will accept that as well. But there will be no new information taken at the meeting where the Planning Commission will deliberate. So please get all of your information to the Planning Commission this evening, or let's say within 2 weeks after this meeting, so that they will have all that information for their deliberations at the upcoming meeting. So we will, in order to orderly gather information this evening and evidence, we're going to follow the following format. First have the presentation or presentations from the applicant or the applicant's consultants. They'll make all their presentations. Then the commission will ask questions of those folks. Then members of the public or anybody else here this evening who wishes to ask questions or make presentations will be allowed to do so. We'll make sure that everybody has a chance to do so this evening. If for some reason it runs long, we'll schedule another continuation of this to gather that evidence, but we're going to make every effort to get everybody in this evening to present whatever information they'd like to or ask whatever questions they'd like to. So that's that, and we do ask and will require that everyone who wishes to speak or present evidence this evening, before you do so, be formally recognized by the chair. So raise your hand if you want to speak, if you want to present something to the Planning Commission, etc. The chair will recognize you. Please go up to the podium. We ask that you do sign in so that we know who was here. Sometimes it's hard to hear and I miss names, so if you would sign in when you present evidence or ask a question, please do so. That's up at the podium, and we ask you to do that before you address the Planning Commission. Just to reiterate, we're going to make every effort to get everybody up so they can speak if they'd like to, but we do ask that this be done in an orderly fashion. So with that, I'll let Michael start the meeting.
All right, thank you, Dan. It's interesting that you've all sort of gathered closest to the podium. I don't know whether you were anticipating that or not, but at least the walk will be shorter. It also, we hope, gives us the opportunity to be able to hear a little better if we're coming to the front of the room rather than the back of the room. I'd like to begin by asking my two commission co-members to introduce themselves.
I'm Nicholas Lassoff. Evan Udesky.
And I am Michael McDonough, Chair. And Ken Sweerad is one of us, but he is recusing himself from these deliberations. And so I would like to call on the applicant to come forward, introduce himself and any people who will be speaking and presenting with him this evening. And the floor is yours.
Thank you. Rodney Galton with Ecos Energy. And first I'd like to thank the Commission for arranging this meeting and allowing a reconsideration of the Chelsea Solar site for preferred status. Unlike last meeting, we do have the consultants here that did the design, the analysis, and they will be going over how they came up with the current design and how it meets the town standards. Excuse me. So I have Ian Jukes from Krebs and Lansing, Michael Busher from TJ Boyle Associates, and Mark Kane with SC Group, and they will be taking over from this point.
Hello, I'm Ian Jukes from Krebs and Lansing, the civil engineer. I wasn't here for the last meeting, so forgive me if I'm jumping over something or going over things that you've already heard. Our civil design for the array on this site is primarily, our task is to design an array area that's in a position that can be shielded by the existing vegetation. So to do that, it's a bit of a cut on the northern part of the site. Walk up here. So this part of the site's a cut, and then this is a fill. And from a civil point of view, usually the thing you're worried about there is controlling water, stormwater runoff, water you can hit when you excavate. So the way this is going to get constructed is we're going to put a curtain drain in at the top of the slope. Probably one in the middle, just depends on how much water you hit as you excavate down, and then one down at the bottom of the slope. The slope would be like a 3-on-1 slope, pretty typical highway embankment kind of slope. There's steep as 2-on-1, this is a 3-on-1. The water we collect out of the bank will get brought back in this area, it's a fill. And then we're going to take the soil, it's very hard soil, it's like a almost rock kind of soil. And we're going to take that soil, put it down here, and re-infiltrate the stormwater down in that area. So, I think we have a good way to control the water coming off the slope, and that's really, from the civil point of view, our real task here. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Well,
am I screwing up the
well, I think we would
procedure?
prefer if you all, the applicants and their representatives, would give a complete presentation. Okay. And then we'll turn it over to questions from the commission and then the audience. Okay. So the only thing that I really have left here is that this area, the elevation of this area and this area were worked out carefully with the aesthetic consultants to make sure that they got to the point where the existing vegetation that's going to remain is still screening the array. And I think that's pretty much all there is to it for us, other than just constructing a normal road in. It's not particularly unusual. But for your preferred site analysis, I think that's what's important. All right, thank you.
I'm Mark Kane. I'm Director of Community Planning for SC Group. Thanks, Ian, for the overview. I'm just going to call up one of the figures that were prepared as part of my report. That's Mike's. Yeah. Just to kind of provide a little bit more context to what Ian was talking about, because I think that's certainly helpful for your understanding of what the process was to get to the design that Ian just described. That's not mine, no. It's under, I think it's that one. Next page, yeah. Next page, yep. Too many. There you go. Great. So I'll get into a little bit more detail about what we did as part of the analysis, but I think from a context perspective, this is a useful three-dimensional illustration of the site. Maybe I'll stand on this side if it's okay for the audience. Three-dimensional image of the site relative to the context around it. So just for reference, this is Route 7 North, this is the 279 corridor, that's the Vermont Welcome Center. This is the array that Ian just described, and I think the other thing that's really important to see is this is the clearing limits around the array that are being proposed to accommodate it. So one thing that's very important from the analysis that Ian was talking about, one of the mandates that we were all given in doing our work was help ECOS understand what elevation the array needed to be at so that when you were off-site, it could be entirely screened. That was the kind of the mandate. So what you're seeing in front of you today is the culmination of that effort, but there was lots of iterations where we were exploring various configurations of the array to allow it to lower in elevation so that the surrounding vegetation could be effective in screening. So this is the final, like a iterative version of that. And there was many iterations where we would do that. We would change the array. Ian and his engineering team would adjust the array, we'd evaluate it, and determine, well, you can still see it from a certain plane vantage point, another vantage point. Now, how do I see you facilitate that? We did two things. One is, what you're looking at here is a detailed three-dimensional model of the area around the array. Basically, this is about a quarter mile to half mile, depending on how you draw the line. We put that model, this detailed model, into a model that goes out about 4 miles or so, depending on how you draw the line. That covers most of the community, all the way from the Bennington battle line area, all the way north past the array, up on that. And this three-dimensional model sits on top, or in that three-dimensional model, the bigger three-dimensional model, to allow us to kind of fly around and say, okay, where can we see it from, and where we can't see it from. That was a really important part of that support of the design process, to say, okay, if we shifted the array south, what would happen? If we shifted the array east, what would happen? If we lowered the elevation of the array, what would happen? So we went through a series of those iterative steps, and this is the configuration that was identified. Could you go to one more slide forward, please?
Slide 4?
Yeah. So we're touching.
It is.
So this is kind of going out, big picture. Oh. This is the array. This is the project property that we're talking about. Again, the 279 corridor north is that direction for reference. Here is the Mount Anthony Golf Course, which has been kind of talked about. The Bennington Monument's here. This is the Southwestern Vermont Health Center, and this is I guess it's going to be Vermont State University campus here, Vermont State campus there. And so these are some of the vantage points that we looked at. I think one of the things really that came out in our analysis was there's kind of like 2 view sheds of the project, essentially. There's a view shed, potential view shed that's kind of in and around the vicinity of the project, so within about a half a mile. So that would be mostly related to the 279 corridor. That would include places like the Vermont Welcome Center and the Route 7 North travelway, which goes right along the side of the project property. And then there's a longer distance vantage points that are sort of out, and this is about this is about a mile and a quarter or so, and it goes out to about 3 miles and such as you get further out. The distinguishing characteristics of those 2 vantage points are this is obviously lower elevation, generally speaking, and it kind of gets at elevation as you kind of go up Route 7, but this is kind of lower in elevation, and this is slightly above elevation of where the array is planned for. So back to the point about lowering the array's elevation relative to its surroundings, that had a profound effect on its ability to be seen off-site from both the near adjacent view shed as well as the further view shed. Essentially, what it allowed it to do is lower the panels themselves and allow those panels to be screened more effectively by the vegetation that's along the southern edge and along the western edge. Can you go a couple slides forward, please? Go like pass these to the first. Okay. So we're back to sort of the near-term, near-site new sheds. So this is a vantage point that's looking right along Route 7, heading north on the highway. This is the three-dimensional model that I was talking about. And because of the nature of this particular vantage point, this is on the actual highway corridor, on the on-ramp of the highway corridor. It's not a place where people are going to necessarily stop and watch, but we wanted to address it because it's kind of the most proximate location to the array. Essentially, it's a couple hundred feet roughly of vegetation and terrain that intercedes. The purpose of using the model was, again, to help us, as you'll see, as you saw in the package, simulate some different conditions. So what would it look like with trees with leaves on, what would it look like trees with leaves off? Two very important distinguishing characteristics of the landscape that we wanted to make sure we could understand the impact of those conditions on the potential offsite visibility. So this is a vantage point that's relatively close. Again, there is interceding vegetation. There's a reference photo that was taken to kind of give us an approximation of the models versus the reality. And it's similar. It's a model. It's not reality. We didn't build the project, obviously. But the purpose of this model is it's controllable. So we were able to use, accurate three-dimensional data to create the terrain. And we also, the ecos was able to get a drone flyover of the property to help us understand the heights of trees within the property. And those data points were used to simulate the location of and height of the vegetation that's on the property. So it's helpful as reference points. You can keep just going through a couple of these. I'll have you stand over there. Yeah. Go to the next one, please. Down or up? Just the next slide. Yeah, so this is looking at, in some of these simulations we looked at proposed conditions and existing conditions, so you can sort of see what the differences were between proposed conditions. So this is existing conditions, and you can't really discern anything noticeable. And that's because, for two reasons. One is, there's already significant vegetation between the Route 7 corridor and the project. It's 150 to 200 feet, plus or minus, and it varies as you go north. But there's also now, because the arrays have been actually changed in its elevation, there's actually terrain that's also interceding now, which if you're familiar with previous versions of this idea for a solar array here, that wasn't the case in all scenarios. So that's actually a byproduct. One of the byproducts of the lowering of the array is that it's having an effect on offsite visibility both near to the project as well as further distances, which I think is important. The other byproduct of the redesign of the array and its location is it's actually minimized the clearing even more significantly. So we've got a lot of clearing in the areas where it was needed. So in the southern edge of the array, for example, it's more generous clearing. On this western edge of the array, we have a good buffer of vegetative clearing because of the way the array's position. Go to the next slide. Again, we looked at leaf-off condition. And again, the characteristics of the landscape here are predominantly deciduous. So we're seeing a lot of that, but there is some conifers in there. Obviously, in the northern part of the property, there's more conifers there. Again, the leaf density of the understory is pretty significant, so the array is not visible from this particular vantage point. Next slide. So this is a cross-sectional view of the array and its position relative to the Route 7 corridor. So you can see this is the Route 7 corridor here, this is the vegetation that intercedes, and this is the array's position here. So we've actually reduced the visibility of the array in part by the orientation of it as well as the preservation of this significant area of existing vegetation, which will be effective in entirely screening. And then obviously as you go further to the east, there's the remnant orchard. The next slide. Route 7 Welcome Center. This has been a big conversation piece. Again, this is a vantage point that I think Mike will talk about as well. Route 7 corridor heading up north, parking lot of the Welcome Center. The view of the Welcome Center is obviously kind of almost due south and slightly to the east of the actual proposed array. This is the simulated existing conditions, and you see there's obviously some vegetation that is actually interceding. If you go just a couple ahead, there's the winter one that's probably the most effective one to see. Okay. So again, this is the vantage point. There's not a lot of opportunities for visibility, and everything would be effectively screened by the existing vegetation that's preserved. Again, there's a big block of vegetation that's south of the array that's still preserved. Obviously, there's the access road through it, but the access road through it doesn't go straight up, which would put it on axis with this view. It actually cuts across at a diagonal, which allows the vegetation to be maintained south of it to improve the screening. Let's go to the next one. And this is again the cross section, I think, which illustrates that point. So we're here at the Welcome Center, at a fairly significant distance. This is still like 1,700 feet or so to the nearest panel. It's a pretty significant distance. But you see there's vegetation maintained here, vegetation maintained here, both of which are super effective at addressing the screening of the view from this vantage point. So now we're getting into some simulation work that we did to get us back to the longer range view. And I think it's really important, I think Mike might talk to this too, is that when you start getting out at 15,000 feet away, some of these vantage points are that far away. So this is about a mile. This is a little over a mile away. There's a lot of factors that play into the potential visual impact. So the question about effectively screening the project is one of relates to the physicality of putting things in between the observer and the array itself. Right? That's part of it, for sure. When you start getting out to distances like this, a lot of other factors play into the potential impact of any visibility of any visibility project, and that is distance, atmosphere, conditions like that will have a profound effect. And you can see this is just a summer day, July 8th, 2021. It's a hazy summer day. That is a typical thing you'll see. That will affect somebody's ability to see this. Next slide. Well, what you are kind of looking at, if you look online, your packet that was provided to you, you'll see there's a slight change in characteristics of the landscape here, and that is basically you're seeing the northern edge of the clearing associated with the array, essentially. So as Ian described, there's the array, there's the area of clearing to the north and slightly to the east. That's what becomes visible, essentially. So from a landscape perspective, the visual change is now seeing a little bit what looks almost like an open meadow, if you will. Go to the next one. Looked at this in fall conditions. Fall conditions reflect, there's a bigger contrast visually, so you're seeing a lot of color, which is absolutely gorgeous and beautiful, and there's obviously a lot of color there, and obviously that's something that would be important to understand. If you go to the next slide, similarly, the idea is you're seeing not the array itself, you're seeing the clearing associated with the site work necessary to put the array in its elevation position. This is the kind of thing that if you sort of see out there are other aspects, there are other places within the community where you look out to the hillsides and you do see open fields. There's obviously some power lines that you can see, the corridors for those things. There's properties, individual properties you can see clearing. You see the highway corridor is a good example of seeing an open, cleared area. I suspect, looking back from the highway corridor, you saw the golf course. I saw that golf course today in South Minnesota. So there's obviously these kinds of things that exist in the landscape in terms of openings in the wooded pattern. Next slide. And then this is the leaf-off condition. So this was taken about a year ago. And similarly, you can see the gray sort of tone associated with the stems of all the trees. And you sort of see some of the areas of green, which represents those conifers I was talking about. But this is kind of a typical leaf-off condition. Go to the next slide. And again, you'll see this is in this case we're trying to it's trying to match up some of the characteristics of some of the other open areas at this time of year. So if this is this greenish area, that's open meadow in terms of the landscape, in terms of its appearance. If there was snow, that would be white, and it would look like every other place that's open. So again, the cross-sectional view, you'll 6,400 feet away, a little over a mile and a quarter. And you're looking at, this is at the high point of the golf course, this is where this was taken. So this is kind of representing that high, the elevated vantage point from sort of distant areas of the community. Super important to recognize, though, I think that, back to visual impacts in the project is it's still, because of the nature of the grade, because this was lower in elevation, this vegetation is still able to do some significant screening of the project, even from a far vantage point. It's pretty much on elevation, all 45 feet, I believe, higher elevation than the elevation of the grade. Okay, let's go to the next one. I think that may be it. That's it. So, just in summary, a couple things. The other thing I wanted to just could we go back to CS2 just for context. It's the second slide. Okay, great, thank you. One of the other pieces of the analysis that we provided was to looking at the again, this is the point of consideration in today's proceedings, is whether or not this site could be or should be considered a preferred site. And so I think it's really important to recognize that according to the 2018 Energy Amendment that was adopted, there are basically 3 pathways that policy describes for determining some site to be a preferred site. One of them is it on the preferred site map? We have a map, I think it's figure 7A, that actually says these are the locations in the community where you have determined it's an appropriate location for a solar facility. So you identified specific locations within the community. It's interesting to note in that determination, you guys looked at whether or not the solar resource was primary solar resource, secondary solar resource. You did look at whether or not the sites were compatible with solar energy development. Obviously, it's a really important consideration. You don't figure out a site that doesn't work for solar. And a couple of the sites on that preferred map were identified as having secondary solar, which is kind of, you describe in the energy amendment, there's some distinctions around that, but essentially it's not the red zones, it's the yellow zones on figure 7, which is the area of indication of secondary solar. I noticed that on that energy amendment, basically it looks like the entirety of this project area is identified at least as a secondary solar resource area. So it's been identified in the energy amendment as having some value towards energy development. So that's one pathway, is you can find a site that fits that criteria. Another pathway is you've identified a series of land use characteristics like former quarries, areas of large retail and commercial development, areas in proximity to develop, other sorts of industrial development, that kind of thing. We've identified as being potentially compatible with being preferred site spot. Again, those are less specific, but the criteria identifies that. And then the third one was this provision that said basically demonstrating that if a project is entirely screened by existing hedgerows, that's another mechanism for a preferred site. And if I'm correct, I believe that this Planning Commission considered another project in Battle Creek, the Battle Creek project, for a preferred site status as well. And I think that that was another project where there was wasn't necessarily implicitly identified on the map as being a preferred site, but that through your determination of the potential project impacts and all, they determined that as a preferred site. So I think the question that we're trying to identify is that based on our reading of the energy amendment, there is, we believe that with the site planning work that Ian described, that with those improvements to the site to allow it to accommodate this facility, it would be entirely screened from offset vantage points. So that would satisfy that third pathway towards preferred site determination. It's also important to recognize that any sort of determination about a preferred site doesn't mean all the other criteria are out the window if this project goes forward to 248. Clearly, all those things have to be addressed, and that's clearly part of it. It's really the narrowness of this idea: is it a preferred site or not? And I think that based upon our understanding, it looks like it would be a preferred site. I think that's all I wanted to talk about. Do you want to-
Hello, my name is Michael Busher. I am the owner of TJ Boyle Associates. We're a landscape architecture and planning firm in Burlington. I don't know if any of you were on the board on the commission 15 years ago. We had a whole series of meetings talking about the substation that was over on the hillside over there. And that was one of the projects that we helped to work with Bennington to locate that.
Can you talk about, speak up? Sure.
Sorry about that. So I have experience sitting in this room in front of the commission, talking about matters of visual impact. Our firm particularly does a lot of visual impact work. We work on a national level. We work with the U.S. Department of Energy, Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service. We've done projects, you know, we've done hundreds of projects in Vermont, and we've done hundreds of projects nationally. So this is a project we've been working on for a long time. It's unique because this project's being built to a standard that no other type of development in the state of Vermont is being built to. The criteria that we're going after is to be for the array to be entirely screened. No other type of development in Vermont has that requirement. So when we're approaching it, it requires us to approach it from a different standpoint. And it requires additional efforts to allow that to happen. There's not many pieces of land that you can, when you look at all the different constraints, when you look at the environmental constraints, when you look at infrastructure constraints, when you look at the visual constraints, there's not a lot of pieces of land that is going to meet that requirement. We worked, just as Mark did, and by the way, this is unique that there's two visual consultants working on a project, and we didn't collaborate. We came up back for the original design. There was, the client identified the want to have a second opinion just to make sure they were coming in from the right standpoint. So our evaluation is 100% independent from what Mark and Mrs. Group did. When the criteria came out and Ecos was given a second chance to look at this site, we worked quite closely to understand what type of arrangements, what type of grading, how this project is going to be arranged to allow it to be 100% screened, or the surrounding vegetation to screen the entire array. One of the things that we did is you see all the orange dots are viewpoint locations, and we went in there and we're not taking photos looking at the array, but we're taking photos looking back away from the array to see what type of visibility there is, and all those photos are included in our photo inventory in our report. We use GIS analysis software to understand what the potential visibility is. That also creates a 3D model that allows us to put up screens and understand different components. This is a rougher model, not refined like the one Mark showed you, but more of a technical model. So that allowed us to work with Ecos and understand if the gradient's a little bit lower in the back and a little bit taller in the front, what does that do from different vantage points throughout the study area. The other thing that creating that model does is it allows us to create photorealistic simulations. And we prepared photorealistic simulations from 4 vantage points now, and these were identified as being some of the locations with the highest potential for visibility of the project. Can you go with the simulation? So this is simulation 1. This is from the Welcome Center. What we like to do is provide a cover sheet that shows you a panoramic view that provides context, so it's not limited to the single view that you're looking at. The cover sheet includes information about when the photos were taken, viewpoint information, also includes viewing notes. So to view a simulation, you have to have it in a proper perspective. So if these are printed at 11 by 17 and you're holding them roughly at arm's length, that's more or less the perspective you're going to have this view in real life. So if you can go to the next page. So this is the existing conditions looking from the Welcome Center. And this is the simulated view of looking from the Welcome Center. We have photos in the report standing back in the woods looking back, and there is no visibility of the Welcome Center looking at from that direction. Can we move on? So this one's up in the adjacent neighborhood. One of the big changes from the last time this proposal was here is there was part of the efforts was to move the entire array back away from this wood edge, so retain that hedgerow, and the grading also lowers it. So not only would views be screened by the adjacent vegetation, but they would be screened from the adjacent landform, the existing view. So this is the existing view. And this is the simulation. So you can see that there's loss of vegetation, but there is no...
Sir, excuse me, could you move out of our way so we can see the...
And go back one slide, please. What, you said that was current? Sorry, I'm just trying to get a frame.
This is existing conditions,
Okay.
and this is proposed conditions. So there's a loss of vegetation, but there's not visibility of the array. Next. Similar location to what Mark was showing you. This is up on the country club, again, the panoramic view. So when you're looking, this is the view of the simulation, but you can see all the other context around it. It's not Mount Anthony, it's escaping me, and I know the name of it. Help me.
Mount Anthony Country Club.
What?
Is it possible for the name of the golf course?
Mount Anthony Country Club.
No, the mountain on the east side of Bennington, regardless.
Well, there's Bald Mountain, and
Yes.
north of that is,
I'm going to say
yeah.
Bald Mountain.
Okay.
Bald Mountain. So, there's a lot in this view, not just the view towards the project site. So if you go to the next, this is a winter view. There's a lot going on in this view. Again, the larger landforms are to the left and the right. There's a lot of visibility of the existing development down in the valley bottom. And then if you go to the next project, similar to what Mark was saying, there's evidence of the clearing, but still the entire array is fully screened. More recently, we were asked about views from the old Southern Vermont College campus. This one, all the other ones, we were in leaf-off conditions. We tried to use leaf-off conditions as much as possible because that shows things in the most vulnerable or with the most potential visibility. So because we were recently asked to work on this, we had to use photos that we had in stock. So this is on the edge of the open lawn. The main building would be behind the viewpoint location. If you go to the next spot, there's the view looking towards the project. You can see some of the road infrastructure in the way. And again, there's an indication of the clearing, but again, the array is fully screened. So I don't feel like I need to go into a lot of detail. Mark covered it. You have our report. I think it is important to note that our report is based on the Queechy analysis. And the Queechy analysis has two parts. And the first part is to determine whether it's adverse. Our findings was this project's not adverse. With that finding, you don't even need to go and move into the second part of Queechy. This is a good project. It's extremely lot of attention put to the siding, to make sure that the revised plans for it conformed with the town plan, to allow it to be fully screened, to meet the energy needs of the region and the town and the state. You know, this is a major component. We're not meeting our rules in this state, and it's difficult. So, you know, our finding was that this was not an adverse project. There were no adverse visual impacts. Not that because it's found not to be adverse, and then therefore not result in undue adverse impacts, according to the I think that would be pretty much a summary of what I have to say. I don't know if there wants to be any follow-up. So we'll leave it at that. Thank you.
And that does conclude your presentation?
Yes.
Yes, all right. I'll turn to the commission and I'll ask if we have any specific or additional questions to ask of the applicant. Yes.
Question directed to Mark. Mark, on your, were you the author of the visual impact assessment report?
Yes.
Okay. Question on page 14 of that report.
Okay.
It says, while this general assessment suggests that the off-site visibility is effectively and naturally screened, SE Group recommended a more rigorous analysis of potential visual impacts from representative critical viewpoints to support this assessment. Was a follow-up analysis conducted? I mean, it says here that it was recommended. Just curious about the details.
Yes, thank you for that. Yeah, and they was actually, and that under beginning on page 12 of the report. That's the 3 additional photos, 3D modeling and photo simulation work that we did. That was kind of the follow-up because we had identified those vantage points, those potential vantage points, as like the Welcome Center is proximal to the site. And as Mike said, you know, from his perspective, they looked at it from on the site outward. We kind of looked at it from outside the site towards it. And we recognized that the Welcome Center was one of those areas where it's an area of public aggregation, it's a state facility, highway corridor. We need to make sure we do a little more work to figure out what is potentially going to happen as a result of this project to that vantage point. So that was the follow-up work with the cross-sectional analysis and the simulation work.
Okay. And curious why an analysis wasn't done from 279 coming into Bennington. I mean, it's kind of heading almost straight towards the site, so maybe if you could elaborate on methodology there.
Sure. Yeah, we did look at, we did look at that location in terms of the generalized view shed analysis, and we've determined that, because of the orientation of the viewer in that vantage point, it's a travel corridor, so you're moving through it. It's definitely not a place to stop and stare. You're moving through it quite fast. It's got a lot going on around it. Again, I think the elevational position of that relative to the array and the screening on the periphery of the array, we sort of look at that and said, that's probably not going to be an issue because of that grade change and the elevation, the relationship between the natural screening there and the elevation of the observer moving along that corridor. And so we opted to look at the Welcome Center as kind of an alternative to the 279 corridor because it's a stationary proximal location.
I guess maybe I was referencing maybe a little bit further west of the corridor on 279, maybe sort of parallel to where the golf course analysis was taken.
Yep.
So I think you had mentioned, you said that the golf course sits about 45 feet higher from the simulation.
Yep.
Just curious, yeah, so 279 is on the same level there or lower?
279 would be below the golf course though, because the point of the golf course that we chose to model from was the high point of the golf course. So I think it's up by the first tee, somewhere up there. So it's actually pretty high. It's the top of the hill, basically, top of the golf course. The 279 corridor is obviously lower than that. So that's one reason, again, back to looking at it just from a general perspective, we didn't feel like that was going to be a very representative situation relative to the other 2 we picked. We did consider it in our analysis, but it didn't raise up to the level of a critical viewpoint.
Okay, that's clear, thank you.
Guys, anything?
Yes, and I'm not sure whether this is to be for Mark or for TJ Boyle's representative, but is there, do you know of an example of another area or another site where preferred area status was granted based on the kind of site preparation that you're talking about here, the excavation that's required?
Are you asking if we worked on solar projects that had excavation? Yes. The short answer is yes, definitely. For this specific purpose, probably not. But at the same time, we've never approached a project that was, the intent was to have it and fully screen the entire array. That's not a typical criteria that's used.
Thank you.
So my only point is that the efforts are to meet the criteria, and they seem appropriate.
Ian, I think you were going to Harlan.
Yes.
So that Harlan landfill project was a solar project. The Harlan landfill solar project a couple of years ago, probably 8 or 9 years ago now. More, maybe 10 years ago. Yeah, it's been a while. But that was located adjacent to the I-91 corridor.
Right, and then there was an extensive amount of grading work that was done on that project, partly to assist it in its performance from a solar perspective, but also there was some consideration of the placement of the array relative to the highway corridor there, and that by changing some of the grades that we end up getting a better ability to sort of screen it, for sure.
Thank you.
Nick, do you have any?
I have some questions arising out of Ian's presentation, but they really don't have to do with the visual
That's okay.
impact.
Yeah.
We alerted the applicant that there may be questions about the site preparation.
Okay. What will the depth of the slope,
I think
resultant depth of that slope?
the total from the top to the bottom of the slope,
Yeah.
I think it's 18 feet. I think it's the steepest or the biggest drop.
And what will the resulting slope be?
It's 3 horizontal, 1 vertical.
And how's that going to be vegetated or stabilized?
It's going to be, first of all, the most important thing to stabilize it is to control the water. So we're going to do a curtain drain at the top of the slope, probably one in the middle and one at the bottom, and move that water, down to the bottom of the site. Once you have a 3-on-1 slope, that can just be, a normal grass surface on it. So you just prepare it as normal, put topsoil on it, and grow grass. And then it would eventually grow up into whatever.
So it won't be maintained in any way?
There's only part of it would need to be maintained as a grass, and that's on the sides. Rodney, if you can get back to the thing. From a shading perspective, there is a need on the east and west side of the array to keep it short. So on this side, and well, it's not hard enough to slope there, but this slope would have to stay fairly small, maybe 5 to 7 feet tall kind of vegetation. If you got 30 feet tall, then it would affect the productivity of the side of the array quite a bit. But obviously this slope up here, doesn't matter what happens with that, because that's north of the array, this one's coming from the south.
So lowering the northern end of the array there, does that result in any loss of solar gain? I mean, do you lose any?
Oh, not really.
No.
I mean, you could model it. I suppose there is the spacing between the rows would get slightly bigger if you were building on the existing slope. And that spacing out of the modules would reduce a little bit of shading from row to row. Based on my experience modeling, I don't know if you can really quantify it. I mean, you could plug it into a model, but it would be a very small effect.
And in the materials you submitted, I didn't see a hydraulic analysis of any sort, the surface hydrology.
There are.
You mentioned that
There's borings shown on here. I don't know if the borings have been submitted to you. They were done in 2014, I think. If I remember correctly, it was a while ago. We did plot like a shorthand version of it. I think there's a point there and there. So it is on the plan for you. It's the soils, there's groundwater in the slope. There's soils that are pretty hard in there. Like, so the blow counts are, I don't know if you're familiar with blow counts, but once blow counts get above 10 or 12, it's starting to become a fairly hard soil. These are in the 30 range, the 40 range. That's something that, is going to be really pretty hard to dig. Right, so when you go to excavate that stuff, you're probably going to get out there with a dozer and put one big hook on the back and rip it up, and then come in with the excavator and pull it out. So it'll be almost rocky.
And you mentioned that you'll be then filling the
so then
southwest corner.
You can see, this obviously is the cut up here, and then this is filled in here. So we're going to take the water and put it in that area.
And is the idea to then percolate into the ground?
Right. So we have a big area to take that water and put it back in the ground.
Thank you.
Sure.
I'd like to stay on a couple of aspects of the excavation. And
sure.
I think it ties directly to the question of the preferred site status and the definition of that, which is in our town plan. So this is another detailed question, but I think hopefully it responds to some questions that were raised at the first meeting. You just talked about the subsoil conditions in the area, and there were concerns about how difficult that excavation might be. And there were concerns referenced about the possible need for blasting. I know that you made some reference to that in your engineering report, but I wonder if you could describe, you just briefly mentioned equipment excavation, but what do you do if you hit something that isn't readily movable?
You just basically have to chip it out if you're not going to blast. And
could you describe that process?
Be using a large excavator with a big ram on the end of it. I mean, it'd be big. It's like, the thing that's sticking out would be like that big, and you'd sit there and chip away at it. From what I'm seeing in the borings, hopefully you wouldn't have to do that. This would be the kind of thing you actually could excavate with a large excavator. You'd use a smaller bucket. You'd probably break a bunch of teeth, but with that kind of force, you could get it out of there.
And in your report, you've indicated that there would be no blasting, is that correct?
Right, because it's committed to not blasting to do this job.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I could throw this out to any of you, particularly relative to the screening analysis, the visual analysis. You've talked about other locations and your experience in other locations. There was, I think it was Nick that asked, I'm not sure, if you had any other specific examples of excavation being a tool to achieve screening. And you mentioned, there was mention of some work at a landfill, but I wasn't sure that there was a direct connection with screening. So could you describe your experience with that? And I'm thinking relative to our preferred site definition.
I'll go first. That's a good question. I think that's a very relevant question, and I think the way we were looking at it, the way I would look at it is this. There's been many, I can think of several projects, so the large Coolidge solar project, for example, Mike can speak to this from extensive use, but there's many projects that have grading and site work as part of the design process that, it's not just to serve necessarily the aesthetic outcome, that's part of it oftentimes. It's also related to the array's position and all the efficiencies and all that.
Sure.
There was a project in Grand Isle Solar where there was a berming was actually in place For example, that was part of the landscape mitigation, was actually to take fill and actually pile it up to create a landscape berm to then minimize off-site visual impact. So that's a case where instead of going down, they created terrain. I think when we were talking about the iterative process that we described from getting this design to work and using the language of your preferred siting standard as a kind of the guidepost, we sort of recognize that one of the things it's suggesting is that, or requiring, is that it's not existing. It has to be existing landform and existing vegetation that's actually doing the screening. Again, back to Mike's point about that being a hard standard to accomplish, that is a hard standard to accomplish. And so the only way to effectuate that requirement was to modify the terrain of the site to allow that existing peripheral vegetation and landform to do the job of screening. Some of you may recall, there's many in this room that have been involved in this project for quite a while, that in other iterations of this thinking for the site, we talked about putting in new landscaping, and there was scrimming around the array itself, and there was all sorts of other mitigative treatments that were designed to provide the screening. And I think what we've kind of gotten to, and your standard has kind of forced the issue to some degree, is modify the terrain so that the natural landscape, natural landform surrounding the property, surrounding the array footprint, will actually do the work of screening it. So it has come up. I don't think, as Mike was saying, I don't recall a specific plan that I've been involved with that actually had a entirely screened provision. So that does make it fairly unique in my experience. And I think that but adding in modifying terrain to achieve aesthetic outcomes is certainly part of the tableau of things that you can do from a mitigation perspective, and that certainly has been done in other sites.
Thanks, Mark. Mike, did you want to add?
Sure. I would say similarly, we've worked on a lot of projects that use earth berms to help screen the project. Pittsford, there's one in Pittsford, there's one in Heinsberg, there's quite a few. We've worked on lots of projects that incorporate grading, not specifically to achieve 100% screening, but just to make the array work better, to make everything more tangible. And the grading for this project is to address visibility at a handful of isolated viewing locations. Overall, this project is mostly screened from the rest of the community. This grading is to address visibility from just a handful of locations.
Thank you.
I would like to add to that as well. One of our solar sites in Rutland, we actually had to construct berms along a couple of the property lines to limit the visual impact to the neighbors. So typically, engineering processes are used to achieve and mitigate.
Okay, thank you. Anything else from the commission? You, Dan?
Yeah, if all the commission is done, I just had a couple of quick questions.
Yes, please.
Okay. Often when there's clearing, et cetera, there's tree die-off, et cetera, at the perimeters. What's the plan to preserve the natural screening that's there? Obviously, if much of it dies, it would accomplish the result. Is there a plan to maintain the health of that screening, those plants, et cetera? I don't know if I don't know how vulnerable they will be after the clearings. It'd be interesting to understand what the thought process is on that.
I can speak from my perspective that we haven't directly approached that aspect of it. A tree preservation plan would be appropriate for this project. Generally, if you can save 2/3 of the tree's critical root mass, you're able to retain that vegetation. So that means if there is a large tree right on the edge of the excavation, that tree is not going to make it. It's just, there's too much impact to the roots under that tree. But a lot of the vegetation here isn't overly mature. It's smaller vegetation and pretty robust. So coming up with a tree
Sure, can.
I don't know if you could show on one of the overall site plan or maps, one of the things that's been come up before in when it comes to mitigation of projects and screening is the amount of screening that is actually controlled by the property owner. So I know that this site is mostly surrounded, or is somewhat surrounded by V-Trans property. And I wondered how much of the screening, how much of the plants on property not owned by the applicant is being relied upon to accomplish the result of 100% screening.
Now, let me take a crack at this. This is the property line here. And there's the interstate. There is this strip right here. Sorry, I'm probably in the way. There is a strip of vegetation outside the property line. It's within the public right of way.
There's also a little clump down here. But here's the property line, or the right of way line. So the majority of the vegetation is on the property. Up here it's about half and half, but for the rest of it, it's mostly on
It's
the property.
about 80 to 100 feet of what's here that's within the property, and 20 feet that's on the public right of way for the highway.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Is that it, Ken?
Yep, that's all I had.
All right.
Thank you.
Well, at this point, and we're about at the midpoint, I'd like to open it up to the room with a comment that we certainly have seen information this evening that we had not previously seen. And so I would welcome you to ask questions about the new information that we have seen, as well as make statements, ask questions about the project in general of the applicants. But the floor is yours. If we could just do hand raise and bring you up to the podium. And Annette, I see your hand is up.
Is this the time that I could make a
Yes.
presentation?
Yes, you may. And if you would state your name and perhaps in your case where you reside, and perhaps mention any credentials, seems like the wrong word, but any background that you'd like to identify as you present.
Thank you. My name is Annette Smith. I'm Executive Director of Vermonters for a Clean Environment. I live in Danby. I have been involved in this project since 2014 and have worked on a lot of different solar, wind, telecommunications towers projects that go through the Public Utility Commission, and I assist people in having a voice in what goes on in their communities and participating in the Public Utility Commission process. I'm sort of smiling because I remember the first time I was in this room was in 1999 to deal with a proposed $1 billion natural gas power plant and pipeline project. And there was a big fight because I wasn't allowed to speak until the cameras were turned off. So I greatly appreciate that you are allowing me to speak this afternoon. I also want to speak from my experience serving on my town's planning commission for half a dozen years, and also on the Rutland Regional Planning Commission representing my town for a dozen years or more. And so I want to tell you that I really respect what you're doing here and want to stay very much on topic of what your charge is tonight. Sometimes they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I'm going to show you a picture and show you why this project cannot be 100% screened. This image, which you may have seen last time, was not solicited by anyone. Nobody went out and said, oh, take a picture of the hillside. This picture showed up last year on the front page of the Bennington Banner. And this is the project site. Over the years that I have been involved in these numerous iterations of this Chelsea Solar and Apple Hill projects, I've come to really appreciate your town's planning. And I think I recently learned that Jim Sullivan was responsible for it. And what I want you to recognize in this photo is that you have an industrial zone over here, and you have an industrial and commercial area over here, and none of it's visible from this vantage point. And what you do see is a church steeple and the monument and mountains and a beautiful natural area. And this is what your town plan is about and what it is intended to protect. The other really wonderful thing about this photograph is that it was taken in winter. And so they're talking about cutting these trees. Now, if you read the project application materials, you'll see that the plan is not only to do a cut and fill operation that's really quite massive, but the panels are to be at a 15% slope. Do any of you have solar panels? I do, and I live off-grid, and my winter panels are about like that. They're not flat. So what would be totally visible from this vantage point, and this is not the only photograph that's appeared, this is a popular viewpoint for photographers in this area, would all be white. So you wouldn't just have the forest gone, but you see the snow here, you would have this standing out as a white patch in a way that is totally not supported by your plan. So I think that I'll pass this around so you can look at it more closely, because I think that it's important. This is a little blurry compared to what showed up in the banner. But that's where this project fails to meet the 100% screening. There may be other places, the golf course, I looked at the simulations. You know, these are very highly paid, well-paid experts who have made a lot of money on this case already. As I'm sure you're aware, Chelsea Solar was denied once on aesthetics in the town plan. Apple Hill Solar has been denied once and then remanded to the Supreme Court and upheld the denial. And I mean, it's quite a convoluted case in terms of legal decisions. But the one thing that Mr. Boucher said that I think needs to be addressed is, although it's not his area of expertise, that this is a beneficial project that we need in terms of meeting our energy needs, and that it's a good deal, it's necessary and good project. This standard offer contract was issued in 2013, and the price on it is 13.4 cents a kilowatt hour. The current bids into standard offer are 8.1 cents a kilowatt hour. So this is very high-priced electricity, and it is not needed. Now, the Malones do have and own a parcel in Bennington that is on your preferred site map. They could bid into the standard offer program at that rate, and it's a competitive bidding process. But one reason that they're pursuing this so much is because they would make a lot more money if they can get this standard offer contract. So I just felt that that was an important fact for you to have. One other fact that I think is important that hasn't come up tonight, but it may have at the previous meeting, and I think I've heard this represented. So Chelsea Solar, number one, was denied by the PUC on aesthetics in the town plan. And it was appealed to the Vermont Supreme Court, and the PUC gave the Malones the opportunity, some of you may remember the amended plan that they came in with, gave them the opportunity to revise it and file a new petition. And so they withdrew their appeal. The new petition came in, but at the same time, the original Apple Hill Solar project hadn't received a decision, so it was allowed to continue under the existing case. And so Chelsea Solar came first, and then, number one, and then Apple Hill Solar came second. But then, on the second time around, Apple Hill Solar came first, and Chelsea Solar, the second time, came second. And so the way it played out was Apple Hill Solar was approved by the Public Utility Commission, and it was appealed to the Vermont Supreme Court by the neighbors. And the key issue in that was that the town had been sued and then entered into an agreement and basically stayed out of it. And so what happened was the Public Utility Commission did not look at your town plan in its approval. So it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, hey, wait a minute, you got to look at the town plan. And so it was remanded back to the PUC, and it was denied on the town plan. And that was appealed to the Supreme Court. And meanwhile, Chelsea Solar 2 came along, and because Apple Hill and Chelsea Solar in the second configuration were to be using the same infrastructure and it was declared a single plant, Chelsea Solar was denied. But it contained the same flaw that the other Apple Hill Solar case contained in the PUC decision, where they did not look at the town plan. So any representation that Apple Hill Solar Chelsea Solar met all of the criteria when it was denied on single plant is not accurate, because at the oral argument, the Supreme Court, the attorney for the neighbors argued to the Supreme Court that please, even if you deny it on single plant, you're going to need to remand it back to the PUC to do the same review of the town plan that you had them do on Apple Hill Solar. So that hasn't happened. Chelsea Solar was denied. That case was decided by the Supreme Court over a year ago. Apple Hill Solar was remanded once again in a complicated decision having to do with the Rural Conservation District. And the PUC upheld its denial on aesthetics and the town plan, and that's now back at the Supreme Court. So eventually, the Chelsea Solar project would have to be reviewed under the town plan, which it has not been to date. And I'm sorry this is confusing, but it's so incredibly confusing.
And Ned, I want to thank you very much for coming down this evening and providing us that background, as well as your take on the matter this evening, which is the preferred site question. So we really appreciate that.
You're very welcome.
Thank you.
Give other people time.
Yes.
I'm just going to talk to it now.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Mario Leon, and my husband and I own Mount Anthony Country Club. And I mean, I'm here just to show you a few pictures and speak about specifically how this industrial development on a hillside would affect the views from Mount Anthony Country Club, but from many other vantage points, such as the monument. I'm just going to show you some pictures. I know it was mentioned during the presentation from the consultants that the view was possibly just from hole number 1. So, but there are 7 holes from the golf course that would be affected from this development, from the clearing of up close to 8 acres. Views from the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th, and 13th hole will be viewing this open space now by the clearing of all the trees. And I think it's impossible to clear, in my opinion, to screen such a space from the vantage points of this golf course, of these holes specifically. So I'm just going to show you, I'm just going to point out different holes here, but this is from hole number 8. And I'm just going to pass them to the commission. And I think some of these pictures, were very similar to the ones that the consultants showed on the presentation. I just put a little handwritten arrow. This is from hole number 9. This is from, I mean, in a golf course, you're moving around. Your hole moves all over the golf course. So you have points of view from everywhere in the golf course and during those holes, and including if you're walking or you're in a cart. Those views are all, imagine screening that from that point of view, in my opinion, is impossible for that height. Another point of view that I want to bring up that it's very close to my heart, I'm very close to it, and it's our Bennington Monument. It is the most visited monument in the state of Vermont, and it is a view that is like no other. Everybody comes, I mean, I think there's close to, I think, 25,000 visitors a year to this monument. People come to this monument to look at the view and take pictures, and a lot of people take panoramic images around it. You do have to stick out your camera and your face out into these openings to view, but it is a very spectacular view that would be forever affecting if this project is constructed. This is a view from one little panel, and it's right here, which it would be very visible and, again, impossible to screen. And I think, you know, what it comes down to, I think it's very simple. This proposal, industrial solar development, is going to be built in a prominent hillside, which is against our town plan. And I want to thank the people and the vision who created this plan many years ago, because it has protected our views and our natural beauty. And that's a big economic force in the state of Vermont. And I think, you know, there are many areas where solar panels could be built and not affect the natural beauty. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
Laura Block. I'm a resident of Apple Hill, along with many neighbors who are here. I thank everybody for coming. I'm the secretary of Apple Hill Association. I'd like to first thank our town for having such a strong and protective town plan to protect our views, as Maru said and Annette said. And I think and we know our town has already designated, I think it's about 500 acres of preferred sites, specifically designated preferred sites. And for some reason, this company decided not to buy a preferred site, but now they're asking you and the town to designate them as a preferred site. So, as Maru said, they can make the same amount of money that they would have made 8 years ago if at that time they had bought a preferred site. And that if they had bought a preferred site, they would have gotten their solar project built probably 8 years ago. It would have just gone through. And as Annette said, you know, Chelsea has already been denied twice on for the same reason that they're now saying it's going to be different. In other words, it's on a prominent hillside, and it's also in a rural conservation district, which doesn't allow any commercial development. That point hasn't been said yet, I think, tonight, but it's a rural conservation district, which doesn't allow commercial development. That's where Chelsea is, and that's also where the adjacent project, Apple Hill, is also. So the town doesn't allow commercial development in a rural conservation district. And I think even if they regrade and lower the entire almost 9 acres, they will still be cutting down all those acres of trees, as other people have said, and it will still be visible. It will be a hole in our forest. And then, since Apple Hill, which is right next to it, they don't want to talk about Apple Hill, but it's Apple Hill is this project built by the same developer. The cumulative impact of both of them will be clearing about 20 acres. So even if they regrade and lower this, they're not talking about Apple Hill lowering it and that being screened. So I think it's important to understand that the cumulative impact of both of these projects will be much more visible from the country club, from the monument, from everywhere that the vantage points are, the main vantage points. And so I hope that the Planning Commission will take that into their consideration when they think of possibly allowing this company to be given a preferred site designation. And I think we all know that they don't need that preferred site. They can go to the PUC and ask for approval, and then they have to go through the Queechee rules and all the designation, all the decisions that the PUC makes, which is not what the Planning Commission makes or the Select Board makes. But they don't need to have a preferred site designation. It just makes it easier for them to slide right through the PUC. And in my opinion, I don't think we should make it any easier for them, because they've already been denied twice. Chelsea's already been denied twice by the Supreme Court for the reasons that it's on a prominent hillside, which it still will be, even if they dig down and have trees around the site. So I hope you will consider not allowing them to be a preferred site, because I think, if I understand that the energy plan of the town, it's not a requirement that you have to do this. You're given the opportunity, if you want to give them preferred site designation, but it's not a requirement. So it's your decision whether or not to do it, and I hope you'll decide not to give them preferred site designation. Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. In the back row.
Mr. Chairman, Paul King, members of the committee. I am a resident in Apple Hill. I do have a couple of slides on a projector I'd like to show you. I've agreed with Dan that we're going to try and make that work, if that's okay.
If you could just shut it off, we'll see if this will fire up or not.
It's making noise, Dan. That's sometimes a good sign.
Risky move.
I'll note from experience, this is one of the riskiest moves that a municipal employee must make, and that's trying to get the projector on. There we go.
I'm going to ask my wife to come and operate the device so I can speak to you from the phone.
Wow.
push it into slideshow. As I said, I'm a new resident of Bennington. I've only been here 3 or 4 months. I do live in the Apple Hill Road area. So some of this information may be very well known to you, but I'm discovering it for the first time. So, I'm probably repeating things that you already have seen, but see if we can get the technology to work. Yeah, go back to slide 1, yeah. So we'll leave it like this for the time being, but I know some of these points have already been made this evening, but there is 540 acres of land shown on your figure 7 energy plan for the town. Some of those are 340 acres of them are in land parcels which are not constrained by any form of development. And so, again, I think I would ask the developers why they've not chosen to use one of those areas, given the length of time they've been trying to make this one project work. It could have been much more economic to have done it by a different route. There are obviously preferred sites on there they could have used as well, but they could have used any one of those red areas. Instead, if we move to the second slide, they've chosen to use this area, which is ringed around in red, which is a yellow secondary area. Now, I understand the town plan doesn't preclude somebody from applying for a secondary area when the unconstrained areas and the preferred sites haven't been used, but only 1 or 2 of those development sites have actually been used to date. So, again, the question would be why should a secondary site that's going to have some visual impact, and I'm going to come on and show that, be given acceptance when there are a lot of other alternative sites that could be used? If we move on to the third one, this is a different point. We're talking, I understand from the civil engineering, correct me if I'm wrong, there's something like planned like a 20-foot drop in that top right-hand corner. You can see there are 3 properties there that have been ringed. One of those is mine. I'll disclose an interest, but it's the furthest one away. But no member of this team has approached us with any kind of report to suggest that our property will not be impacted by that excavation. Yes, I've seen what they've put out to the council tonight, but it doesn't really satisfy me, and I don't have a copy that my engineers could look at and maybe come to a different conclusion. So that's a second different kind of comment I'd want to make. If we move to the next slide, you obviously know the famous road that goes up to Manchester and over towards the Green Mountains, and we all know that's the route the Green Mountain Boys came down. If anybody is going to go to the Bennington Monument and look out from the top, what direction are they going to look in? They're going to look in up that Manchester route, not just because of the visibility, but the historic relationship to that particular monument. If we move to the next one, we have a criteria in the town plan that says the town will not support a site that is impairing a vista or viewshed from a historic resource, and that's from an historic resource, that is a significant component of its historic character and history of use. So the monument is there to celebrate an event, people coming down to take the British. I'm a Brit, but I'm quite happy to be here and say that. I look at the Bennington Monument every morning. It's directly in my view, but that's the direction people are going to look. And of course, where they're going to look is straight through the middle of that solar panel field. There is no way from the top of the monument that can be in any way covered and made so that it can't be seen. We've had comments saying that it could be covered from the golf course, and those have been disputed. But the monument is significantly higher than that, and there is no way, in my view, that you could do that. So if we move on to the next one, that's just giving you that view, which is absolutely fantastic, gorgeous view across the hillside. I actually took that picture 2 years ago. It wasn't done for this tonight. It was before I actually lived here. One of the reasons I came to live here was being up on the top of the monument and looking at that view, and said, yes, that's the kind of place I want to be, and that's what would bring me back to Bennington again and again. And now I'm here contributing to the economy with my own business running in Bennington. So, and if we move to the next one, this is the view taken this morning back across the apple orchards to that monument. You can see how clear that the apple orchards can be seen, and bear in mind the solar panel site is just in front of that and to the right. So, you know, those are the comments I'd like to make. I'm happy to send you a copy of the slides afterwards. I hope you would bear in mind my comments when making your decision.
Thank you. Yes.
Sorry. I got it. Good evening. My name is Bill Knight. Excuse me. I'm president of the Apple Hill Homeowners Association, and I apologize if I'm asking questions. I wasn't here the first time, but there were obligations I couldn't be here. But I was going to ask the gentleman exactly how many trees are you cutting down now, if this would go through? How many trees are you cutting down? How many, sir? Originally it was 29, so I'm not sure if that's correct. But okay, well then also, have you done wind and noise studies, how it's going to affect the Apple Hill Homeowners Association? Well, it will affect us drastically, and we know that for a fact, so maybe you should look into that because it will affect us. And also, I had the pleasure, part of my duties is to meet our new neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. King. And when I met them 2 or 3 months ago, I said, well, at least you don't have to worry. We don't have to deal with that solar company anymore. It's been 10 years now that they've pretty much harassed us and made our life miserable. We've done everything we can to keep that project out of there because it does negatively affect us. So then 2 weeks later, I had to go to them and say, I have to apologize because now it looks like this whole thing's going to start again. So I hope it's not another 10 years. But another area I wanted to touch on was the fact that they said it's going to be 100% screened. I'd like to see that slide again going up Route 7, looking into the woods to the right there, please. Could I see that? It would be the one along here.
It's under my testimony.
Yes, right here you have a more close up of that going up toward Manchester. Yeah. Going back to you saying about this 100% screening, we had a site visit and we walked the whole area down into here. This is going up, and I think you said it's 140 feet inside to get to the project. Well, if you're standing on the road right there. Okay, well, that 150 feet, it may sound like a lot, but about, I don't know, 60, 70 feet of that is wide open. So that's a lot to take away. We all stood inside that thing, so it only leaves maybe another 60 or 70 feet. This is probably 50 feet in this room, so that's not really that much. And when the leaves are off, and the screening that they showed us before, I don't know what you got now, it looked black. They said it was dark green. It looked black. So when you're going out that road, you are going to see what looks like just a huge black, ugly site there. So it's not really what I would call 100% screening. So unless you have something else in mind, but when you talk about this distance, these photos may sound like they're really screening, but in some cases, as the one I've described right here, that's definitely not going to be 100% screening there. So getting down to what we're saying is, once again, this project has been denied, so I don't see why they've really done anything to ensure us it's going to be any better, especially for the Apple Hill Homeowners Association. And the one thing I didn't hear tonight from any of you experts is how it's going to affect Apple Hill. So I guess the human aspect of it is how it affects us, how it affects the town, other than just how it affects making money. So I hope the project doesn't go through. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Well, yes, Annette.
Yes, please.
Okay, yes.
Camera.
I forget what year it was, but the applicant, Thomas Malone, hired a logger to go in and clear the whole site. And the logger apparently went in with a bulldozer and cleared the perimeter all the way around. Can any of you show us on a map where that clearing was done? Have you actually been to the site? Have you seen it?
You can refer to the photo inventory in our report that has photos 100% around that site.
But can you show us where that clearing is?
I can't recall if that was done before or after that clearing.
Okay. So what happened after that was that the Public Utility Commission issued an injunction against the clearing because it violates the statute. Malone appealed that to the Supreme Court, appealed the PUC's authority. The PUC said no, they do have the authority, and sent it back, and it's currently in the penalty phase. And so I don't know how that whole thing interacts with this, but there was some road that was bulldozed through the whole thing. The other question I have for you, Mr. Jukes, is has the cut and fill proposal been reviewed by A&R? Have you shown it to them?
Oh, no, it is.
So you have no idea how. So you have no idea how the agency might review that, or do you know?
You know, it needs to go through the normal process.
So one of the other issues that happened with that bulldozing was that there had been a rare, threatened, endangered plant area set aside, and that was apparently bulldozed through. So the Agency of Natural Resources is very unhappy with what has happened with the promise to protect those rare plants. So that's just another aside, but I was curious to see if we could see on pictures where that was.
Thank you again. Yes.
Good evening, thank you. Dawn King, Paul's wife. Mike, could you queue up CS2? Somebody? Yeah. I love the discussion, first of all, I love Vermont, and I love the discussions about aesthetics. So I just want to kind of talk about that for a minute. Could you tell me when this picture was taken?
That's actually not an image, that's a 3D model of the site.
That was modeled Recently?
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to point out something that's missing.
Air photo may have been from 2016 or something like that.
Okay. I'm going to point out something that's missing from this currently. Right here, on Mr. Malone's property, is a full-size shipping container that was just dumped there. Still there, empty, not really aesthetic. Could somebody cue up the picture of what I see when I wake up in the morning with the stone wall? What's that? What picture would that be? The in front of the orchard, you had it. I'm sorry, the one that you were standing in front of. We asked you to step aside. Could you cue that up for me?
What are you saying? We can't hear you.
Please find it. So the mic is under.
It was one of the pictures that you showed us when you were showing how it wouldn't impact views. That's good. That works. You know what's missing from this picture? That same shipping container that's just sitting there that Mr. Malone has placed on that property against HOA rules, and it's just sitting there. So is that what this project is about? Just dumping stuff and ignoring it and, you know, ruining the aesthetics? Just a question, something I hope the committee keeps in mind.
Thank you. We've got just about everybody in the room. Anyone else? Yes.
As a longtime homeowner, I'm Anna Swear,
Yes,
and as long as my husband isn't allowed to speak, I'll speak. This has been going on for far too long. We live in a development that is a homeowners association, and it is not to be for solar panels, for tractor-trailer trucks, I have not seen whatever is sitting in the field, but believe me, tomorrow I'll make sure I go down and look. We have always loved Apple Hill development. Such a love for the property. The homeowners got together and got a nice plaque to say Apple Hill development. We're neighbors. We're friends. We're companions. We do things with each other as a neighborhood. I'd like to keep it that way. And as a native of Bennington, who came back and was blessed to live in the Apple Hill development, I'd like to keep it that way. So I'm going to ask you to look. I'm not citing any laws right now. All I know is that that's not what Apple Hill was meant to be for. Used to be a beautiful apple orchard with blueberry bushes, and if we're clear cutting, that's not quite so good if endangered species are being taken. Okay? That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Well, do we wish to close on that? Might be a good point.
Michael, I would just say
Yes,
this, since we want to make sure that we get all the information, you folks need to make a decision. I would say if there's any other information that folks would like to submit, please do so now or within the next couple weeks. We will consider additional written testimony. I guess I would just say if there is anything that anybody wants the Planning Commission to consider, please do so within the next 2 weeks. And we will be setting a date for when the Planning Commission will get back together to deliberate before we leave this evening, so you all know, and you can come and watch the machinations of the board as they try to come up with recommendations to the select board. So I just want to make sure that everyone knows that they can submit additional information. That's for applicant and folks, neighbors, et cetera. So free to, we would welcome that and want to have all the information necessary to make the decision. And that's all I would have, Michael, and then it would make sense for us to
yeah, we have one last piece of business.
Try to figure out when the next date
You're going
will be.
right to that.
Yeah. I have reserved, not that you folks are all available, but hoping that you would be, or at least the majority of you folks would be available. I have reserved this room for January 12th from like 3 to 7 o'clock. If that does work for at least the majority of the folks, the 4 folks here. Ken, you're welcome to come, but you don't get to participate anyway. So, so I don't know, does that work for folks? So maybe we could just go down the line and see. Evan, does that work for you?
Yeah, I think so. Let me just check.
Bruce, you think you're good?
Yes.
Nick? Yes.
And Nick's okay too?
Yes.
Okay, so we will meet on January 12th, 2023. What time would you guys like to do that? It could be 3, 3:30, 4 o'clock. What would your preference be?
Well, our regular meeting time is 3:30.
Yeah.
We've pushed it back to 4 to afford more opportunity for people to get from work to join us. I see no reason to jump back to
for this particular
usual time.
Yep.
If the 4 o'clock is working
So
for us,
yep.
and if it's working for you, that's what we'll do.
So before we adjourn this evening, I would just ask that you folks make a motion to adjourn this particular issue to that particular date and time, so that we have it on record and everybody's is aware of that particular determination.
So if there's no other business, I would ask for a motion to continue the process to that January date.
So moved.
Second.
And seconded, all in favor?
That is unanimous.
Okay.
All right, thank you, everybody. Again, if you have other information, let us know. But again, we'll see you on the 12th when the board deliberates. Thank you very much.